Good morning. Welcome to Meet the Masters of Insurance webinar series. This is the 38th of what we expect to be a great many webinars with people who are leaders in our business. We found that most of the people who enter the business and who are successful do it differently, whether they're in the business together, whether they're related, or whether they're in the same field of endeavor. And our goal is to bring out those differences, to help people to have options and learn from the masters how they have done it in the past. Today we have Mr. Ross Durant with us. Ross has been in the business since 1958. He came out of the the Canadian Navy and joined his father's practice. You would think that that would have made it easier, and I think many people say that being second generation in the business gives you an advantage. But a lot of the time, what it means is you have a harder taskmaster and not an easier one. And Ross will help us to understand that as well. Good morning, Ross. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good morning, Lawrence. It's nice to be with you. It really is.
Tell me, Ross, how did you get started in the business?
When I left the Navy in the fall of 1955, I went to work in my father's business. And at that time, he was in the life insurance business, very successful, had a large benefits practice and an estate planning practice. I joined in the benefits practice. My job was to do pension calculations, talk to employees of various companies that we had in analyzing what their needs were and counseling them. And that was my start.
So you were in administration. How did you move from that into insurance sales?
Well, one of my jobs with my dad was the payroll and putting checks in the bank. And I thought, well, if an old man like my father could earn these kinds of dollars, maybe I should be getting into the business directly. So I went to my father and asked if I could get my own license. And he said yes. Now, when I asked my dad this, it was about a month before Christmas. And he set up an interview with me with the branch manager, with single company representation in those days. And after that interview, I was turned over to the assistant manager, Ken Dawson. And one of the things with the Count of Life was that you couldn't discuss your contract with anybody. And I asked Mr. Dawson's permission to show it to my father because I thought my father had the same contract, which he did. So being just before Christmas, my father said, why don't we go down to the National Club and discuss it? I said, fine. Now, normally we didn't drink during business hours, but being before Christmas, my father suggested the bar first. That was my mistake. So over a couple of martinis, my father explained what I wanted to know. And he said, now, is there anything else, son? I said, yeah. I said, I've been offered a draw of $500 a month. Do you think I should take it? And he said, son, do you know what a draw is? I said, I think so. It's an advance against my commissions that I will earn. He said, no. He said, it's a crutch. He said, if you want to be a successful life insurance person, you won't take any draw. Oh, so when I got back to Canada Life and I saw Mr. Dawson again, he said, "Are you ready to sign the contract?" And I said, "Yes, sir, except I don't want any draw." I had to pick him off the floor. So after signing the contract, I went back to my dad's office and he said, "Son, have you signed the contract?" I said, "Yes." Well, he said, "For your information, do you still want to be a good life insurance person?" I said, "Yes." Well, he said, "I'm cutting your salary to $50 a month." I said, "What?" "Yes." And my contract was to take place on the 1st of January. He said, "Yes. And the only reason you're getting $50 a month, because that's what you pay your mother for board and keep, but you can still have liquor privileges at home." I said, "Okay." So that was my introduction to life insurance. And I sure knew that if I was going to eat, I had to go and work.
Yeah. So where did you find your clients at that time?
Okay, my clients at that time were, I got some of them from our benefits business. That, they would ask questions when I talked to them about life insurance, and I would arrange an evening appointment or an after work appointment to talk about it. That was one source. The other source was uh, people that I knew that were getting married, and they had friends who were also getting married. So that was an endless chain of prospecting for me. And I was about to get married. So I understood the problems they were facing. And so that was my initial market. And, as these people advanced in their companies, lo and behold, I advanced as their insurance counselor also. So that's how I built my business.
You had an interesting approach, you told me, for getting people who with benefits through your father's practice to talk with you about insurance. How was that?
Well, they would say, "Well, I'm married. As you know, Ross, my wife and I are expecting. What happens if I die prematurely?" Well, I said, "You're going to get these group benefits, life insurance benefits. If you become disabled, you might get these short-term disability benefits." In the early days, when I joined the business, there was no long-term disability. Do you realize that? That's a fairly recent phenomenon.
So what did you sell? What was included in the benefits package?
My first sales were additional life insurance. Uh, it was like a policy of a combination of whole life and term. But the term was called in those days family income. And it would pay a monthly income for a given number of years. My favorite number of years was 20.
Sort of the dependency period type of
Yeah,
thing.
the dependency period, yes. And then, if they bought houses, and it was an excuse to go back and see them and talk to them about, well, if you die too soon, how is your wife going to pay the mortgage and continue to live in this house?
Yeah.
And that's how I started. And just going back a second, uh, my father was big on education, um, for a number of reasons. His father died in an accident prematurely, And so he had a grade 13, which included 3 mathematics, 2 sciences, chemistry and physics. Then his language, history, just as an aside. Then his languages were English, French, German, Greek, and Latin.
The full spectrum.
And he got first class honors, but there wasn't enough money for him to go to university. My dad lived in a small town of Winchester, Ontario, and he told his mother that for opportunities, he needed to come to Toronto. And when his mother died of blood poisoning, his best friend was a partner in and now what is known as Ernst and Young. But it was, oh, I forget the name of the company. But he told my father he should finish getting his CA degree. He had a chance, which my dad did. And he emphasized education. He said, son, you've got to get your CLU degree. So at my first opportunity, I enrolled in the CLU course. And it was 3 years. And it was 4 subjects a year. And when I finished the first year, they brought LUATC out.
That was the Life Underwriters Association training course.
Yes, and that was a marketing course, and it was very good. And Nev Evely was my course instructor, and he was a real gentleman with Prudential of England, very fine man. And I had a legend in the insurance business in my class, Butch Bowden. I mean, Butch was super. And I had other people like Ben Klein. And from Ben, who was a prolific lies producer, he one day explained to me and to the class, when asked the question, well, if you have a difficult sale and the client says he doesn't want to buy the insurance, he says he takes the client outside to his garbage can and he opens the lid and he says, do you want your widow to have to eat out of the garbage can? I never had enough nerve to do that, but Ben did. And there were beautiful people in that class. And so I did LUATC for my second and third year CLUs. I got both at the same time.
So did you have a lot of daytime activity at that time, or was it mostly evening activity?
But my most of my activity would be early in the morning. You'd be surprised how many people would talk to you at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. Or I'd start at 5 o'clock in the evening. I would go back to the person's place of business and I would have one interview then. And then I would have another appointment where I would go to at the person's home.
But you were
And
saying, I'm sorry, go ahead.
sorry, so those were like, and I did that 4 nights a week. Friday night after I got engaged, and even when I was courting my dear wife, I must admit I'm still married to the lady. It was date night. So
Your wife was from a family that was in insurance as well, wasn't she?
that's right. As I found out when I came home, the story behind that, Lawrence, is that I didn't want to take a certain lady to a high school formal. And I saw my wife playing badminton at the old Granite Club and I said, would you like to go to the movies on Saturday night? And she said, I'd love to, Ross, but I promised my sister I would babysit for her. She said, would you like to come? She said, I understand you're a whiz at math. I said, well, yeah, I'll do that. So our first date was me showing her how to do trigonometry. And when I got up Saturday morning, and my dad and I were going downtown, my dad said, who did you go out with last night, son? And I said, Marilyn Earl. Oh, is her dad in the life insurance business? I said, I don't know, Dad. I wasn't interested in knowing what her dad did. So uh, she got grilled the next day and by her father. Her father asked the same question. So a week or so later, we went out on a date, and the first question we asked each other is, were our fathers in the life insurance business?
The reason I bring this up is that prospecting was something that wasn't just something you did. When you were dealing with young married couples, was your wife, what did she do?
My wife was a good prospector. And she would get up in the paper in the morning, and she would, when you opened your paper, there was the birth column, and she would say, oh, so and so just had a baby boy or a baby girl. You should go and see them, Ross. And I would figure out, yeah, how about I go and see them? And sometimes I would ask my dad, how would I go and see this person? And he'd say, pick up the telephone. So pick up the telephone. And I'd say, well, and I'd say to my mind, well, maybe the person will say no. But my father would say, well, that's the worst he can say to you. And are you going to drop dead because he's no to you? And I said, no. So I got a lot of my business from my wife's observation of her school chums having babies. And that's how I built the practice. She was always helpful to me, not directly, but uh, when you got married in our day, Lawrence, you remember those days?
Do
Did your wife work?
She
When,
did. She did.
okay,
She sold
okay,
she sold OML, Ontario Motor League memberships initially.
okay. Well, my wife worked, was allowed to work until she became pregnant. And you couldn't you couldn't work for wages. So my wife started volunteering. One of my wife's first volunteer jobs was with the Sick Children's Hospital, and she became chairman of the 555 shop. And, she met people, and people would talk to her, and then she would talk to her husband. And then uh, later on, uh, she uh, she was a member of the IODE. And the IODE at that time was involved with North York General Hospital, which was just being built. My father was one of the original fundraisers for that hospital. And, and then my wife got on the board of North York General Hospital. And, it was sort of just like she was my bird dog, if you want the expression. And so she was a great help. I mean, if I want if I want good advice now still, after 67 years of marriage, I still consult her first.
Very prudent thing to do. So Ross, so we'll go back and we're
Yes.
in 1960 or so.
Yeah.
And you were dealing with young married couples, people who were buying new homes in Don Mills and elsewhere. But you weren't just doing direct prospecting. You asked for referrals. How did you do that?
Well, after a successful interview, I would sort of ask the client, uh, could you recommend one or two people to me who might benefit from my services? And lo and behold, they added to the list. I would get names and phone number, and they would, and I would say to them, well, would you mind telling your friend that I will be calling them and I will be calling them about this? And they said, not at all. And so my client then paved the way for me to have an interview.
Were you also still doing group benefits during all of this?
Yes, I was, I had to, in the early stages of the business that I got into, I had to do the benefits business for my father. And it, when I became successful in my own right, then my father started to share the benefit business with me. But I always was working in the benefit business, talking to clients in the benefit business, uh, and they and that was very good training. It really was, and I learned so much from the benefit business. We had one client that I always remember was in the shipping business. And I got a call from the human resources person, and the company was just in the start of a strike. And the employer decided that even though his employees were in strike, he was going to keep their benefits. And the human resources person said to me, Ross, one of the striking employees has died, and the funeral home will not assist until their payment is guaranteed. Can you help us? And I said yes. And I called the vice president in charge of claims of Canada Life. And I said, Jerry, I need your help. And he said, what do you need, Ross? And I said, well, this client has died. The, the widow wants to bury her husband. The funeral director won't bury her husband until he gets his payment. I said, can you issue a claim check? And he said, yes, I can do that, Ross, but you'll have to get the claim form signed before you hand the check to her. I said, okay. He said, I'll meet you at the back door. I had to be in Welland at 8 o'clock in the morning. He said, I'll meet you at the back door of Canada Life at 6 o'clock in the morning. He had the check, he had the form, and a cup of coffee for me. Now that's service. and and so over to Welland I went. I got the lady to sign the claim form. I had a few kind words say to the funeral director, and and she let everybody know. And you see, a lot of these people in the shipping business lived around Welland. The news got out, and within 48 hours, that strike was settled. And the other incident that I was asked by the director of human resources of the same company, they were in union negotiation. And first thing in the morning, when the negotiations started in the hotel, the human resources person and the union bargainer were at each other's throat. The yelling, the screaming, the profanity. And finally, they would turn to me and say, well, Ross, do this. And I would think about it and I'd say, yes, we can do that. Well, they'd look at their watches. It's 11, the bar's open. We'll go up to the bar. I don't know how it happened, but I had the human resources person on one side of me and the union on the other side. So everybody's ordering drinks. And I said, I'll have a Coke. And I got a kick in both shins. And I said, a rum and Coke? So that we would finish getting the point settled. And then we would go back to the bargaining table. And this kept going on all day till about 5 o'clock in the evening when the negotiations concluded. I went home that night, and my shins, both the left and the right, were just bruised. You can't believe. but it was interesting to see, and that same company was the company that fought Hal Banks. And one day at our house, a hearse drew up. And after the hearse moved off, a phone rang and said, next time it might be you. I was never killed.
And just so that the audience knows how good this relationship was, almost 20 years ago, I went into that business to talk about their group benefits with an extremely strong relationship. And they said, no, we're very well served, thank you. So the work that is done of this type, it's almost social work that you're providing as part of your group benefit, certainly endeared you to the client almost permanently, didn't it?
Yeah, listen, group business, the employee benefit business is no different than just selling a single policy. When the employer buys a benefit package, and I hope you'll agree with me, Lawrence, when an employee he's got to communicate it to his employees. Well, maybe their human resources department is sophisticated. Most of them are not. So it behooves the group rep at least to make sure that the human resources department can communicate the benefit that the employee has. And that if the employee has any questions, that he has somebody to talk to. And so what's so different between that and selling an individual policy?
So is the person they asked to talk with the employee you? And what do you do?
I'll go in and I'll sit down with a group of employees or an individual employee, and I'll ask them, what is on your mind? What is concerning you? And, the benefits have gone way up. And a lot of times the employee will say, well, do I need the rest of my life insurance? And I'll say, well, may I ask how big your mortgage is? And they'll tell me. And I'll say, well, your group insurance will pay say 100% of your existing mortgage or 75%? I said, you've got to have other assets to pay off your mortgage. And then I say, well, how is your wife going to eat? You know, we've got food banks. For God's sakes, they can't service the number of clients today. Would you want your widow to have to go to a food bank? I'm sorry. I, I just, I just think that employee benefits is that you have a socially minded employer, an employer who cares about his employees. And if he doesn't, then he doesn't have any employee benefits, or his employee benefits aren't that good.
Russ, it seems to me that the benefit amounts in group benefits haven't kept up with inflation. We were talking just before this started about the cost of your first house in Don Mills being 20,000 and having been sold as a tear down for 800,000 recently. Um, how do you deal with that when you're talking with the employees?
Well, you people, if they have a good, a family relationship and they love their wife, they want to protect that person. I mean, the only person I care about protecting is my wife. I want to be sure that she, to the day she dies, she doesn't have to want for anything. If there's any money left over, then my kids will get it, or charities are going to get it. But my main responsibility is to my wife, who I love dearly. And I believe sincerely with anybody I talk to who has a good marriage that that is their interest too. And all I have to do is to try and convey it to them and bring it out. You know, when the kids are young, when my children were young, I wanted to be sure that they got the best education possible. I have grandchildren. My gift to every one of my grandchildren has been an RASP. I fund the RASP every year to the maximum. I want to be sure as as little as possible when they get out of their university, they don't have a huge debt. That's something grandpa can do for them. Now, I'll be honest with you. I've got two granddaughters in university now, and I've got one granddaughter who's going to go to university next year. Okay, so I will have three in university. What is the maximum amount you can contribute to an RESP? $50,000. Isn't that right?
I
Well,
don't know, but okay.
Okay, so now, all right. So now, if you look at that, you can put in $2,500 a year into their RSP. When they get to be age 18, you haven't put in $50,000. So the question is, what do you do? Well, my solution is I have two at university now. From September to the end to April, they get $200 a month from grandpa to help with their living expenses at university. I call that making up the difference.
So, Russ, did you have a lot of mentors in your career?
Yes, I did. I had I had some of the best people in the business. Like my father was my chief mentor, but I had people like Ralph Simmons, my father-in-law, Butch Bowden, Nori Bowden. These people, I had a study group. You were there.
You were
That
part of the
study
whole.
that study group met every year at at Toby House Cottage. And across from Toby House Cottage, there was a person that everybody knew. His name was Ted Rogers. Ted and I were schoolmates at Upper Canada College along with Toby. And uh, Ted, Toby would invite Ted over on Saturday night, as you remember, for our steak and booze dinner. And Toby, Ted would move around the room talking to all of us individually and collectively. And he said to us, you know, you guys know more about this business than probably anybody else in Canada collectively. Why don't you spread it? So we formed at that cottage. One of those nights, we formed the idea of forming Kilu. Now, do you know who two of the members of Kilu are now? Three that I know of. One is my daughter. Other one is Butch Bowden's daughter. Listen, you've got uh, Toby
Toby's
House
sons,
sons,
Tom's sons.
the First
Um,
Brooks.
no,
All those people are now, and they're sharing their knowledge. So those study groups, and then people. I was fortunate enough to be asked to teach at the life underwriters schools. And I got to go from East Coast to West Coast and in between teaching. And I met people and I was always glad to help them. And and I learned as much at the schools as I taught. I think maybe I learned more. You know, everybody shared. And you know George Sigurdson. Okay, George is a friend of mine. And I got and George was a great friend of a friend of mine who was murdered. And well, yes, that, and uh, the um, but George asked me to come out and speak about income averaging annuities. I said, okay. He said, you got your choice, Ross. He said, you can come out in the wintertime and I'll take you to a Jets game. I said, yes. Or he said, you can come out in May and play golf with me after you talk about income averaging annuities. So I thought about it. And I said, well, George, I think I would rather go for golf. He forgot he supplied a whole can of mosquito repellent. But you know, George and I, we still share this same friend's widow, and uh, I was just finished settling my mother's estate when that came over the radio that this person had been murdered. And it turned out that the murderer was his nephew. Just dreadful. But that be that as it may.
So you were talking about mentoring others. Do they come to you and talk with you? How do people find you to ask you to get you to mentor them?
To get
How do people find you who ask you to mentor you? Do they
a
come to you? Do they ask you for lunch? What do they do?
Yeah, sometimes they ask me out for lunch. And now I don't get so many calls today from colleagues in the life insurance business because I'm past tense. But for instance, in my charity work, I would get I get calls every day of the week from somebody who requires the foundation's help. And sometimes it's a phone interview. Sometimes uh, can we meet for coffee? Or can we meet for lunch? And yes, or can you come to the office or our offices? Yes. Or can you come and tour this with us? Yes. I'm very conscious of the needs of the society. Um, I have had some proud moments. Remember when the $1 Million Round Table met in Toronto?
I do.
Back when David Onley was the lieutenant governor of the province. George Smitherman was the member of parliament, minister of health at that time in Regent Park. And I went to George and he said, I can't help you, but the counselor can help you, the school trustee. I forget her name, but I called her and I said, we would like to use the grounds in Lord Dufferin Public School. Now, do you know where Lord Dufferin Public School is? Well, it's at the corner of uh, Parliament and Dundas. So she arranged for the school board to donate the land where this playground was to be built. Secondly, I went to the union and I said to the union rep here in Toronto, could you donate your services? And he laughed at me. I said, I said, what's so funny? He said, we don't donate our services. I said, well, your union colleagues in the United States have donated their services to build playgrounds in different cities. Why won't you? And he said, well, like what? I said, well, the most recent one was in Los Angeles. Oh, he said, oh, he said, leave it with me. But he said, if you lied to me, you'll never hear from me. About an hour later, I got a call. He said, when do you want us? I said, it's the Monday morning of the holiday weekend, the 24th of May weekend. That's when we're going to do it. He said, okay. So they came. They were super. They were great help. And finally, uh, I said to a fellow member of the Legion, who is the aide de camp to Onley, I said, do you think you could get his honor to come and open this playground? I said, this will go over big with the $1 Million Round Table. And he said, sure. He said, Ross, is it wheelchair accessible? I said, I think so. And I went to my union friends and they said, yes, we'll make it accessible. And So David came, and one of the things that the kids wanted were basketball hoops. And to open the ceremonies, a young lady from grade 8 at Lord Dufferin Public School was to sing the Canadian national anthem and the American national anthem. The American national anthem is very difficult to sing. She sang the Canadian anthem beautifully, and she started having trouble with the American. Mrs. Onley put her arm up on the young lady's shoulder, and the two of them finished the American national anthem as a duet. When the ceremony was all over, the kids started throwing hoops, and David in his wheelchair wheels out into the playground, and he says, "Can I play too?" And David threw hoops with these kids. It was an event I'll never forget. And the plaque dedicating that for the $1 Million Roundtable is still there.
That was the MDRT Foundation that provided the funding for this?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
How did you get them to do that?
They came to us. Evidently, the MDRT Foundation, in every city, they have their convention. They want to leave something. And this playground thing was established. And so the people who were organizing it for Toronto that's how I got involved. And it was, you know, it's their school population has changed. And the principal of the school, I went to him when we were building the project, and he always would come out to see how things were coming along. And I said, "Do you have any trouble with your students?" He said, "No." He said, "We open our doors at 7 in the morning." He said, "We feed the kids breakfast." I said, "Oh?" He said, "Yes." He said, "The only problem we have is at 6 o'clock at night." I said, "What problem do you have at 6 o'clock at night?" He said, "We have to kick the kids out." He said, "These kids, they've all come from third world countries. Their parents know that the only way out of the ghetto is through an education." I remember with the service club I belonged to that I got involved with my former grade 8 teacher, Miss McNabb. She was the principal of a school down in the area. And I said, "Have you got any students who are in grade 8 who are going to go to high school?" Now, the high school they went to was Jarvis Collegiate. Now, I said, "We would like to provide scholarships for these kids." Now, back then, Mama and Papa or both could be in the slammer. And these kids didn't have any decent clothes to wear to Jarvis Collegiate. They didn't have meals. Our job was to help them buy their books, to clothe them properly so they didn't feel out of place at Jarvis Collegiate. Every one of those students that we helped got a university degree. Some of those people even became clergy people. And and where are they working now? They're still working in Regent Park. Excuse me. We owe you've got to reach out, especially if you're more fortunate than others. You've got to reach out.
Rose, you built up a very substantial benefits practice over the years. I would imagine that not much of it came from your father's practice, that you built it, most of it yourself. How did you do it?
Here's the truth. I, I would be referred to see different people, different corporations. Some of the corporations, their presidents were my individual clients, and I passed my business on to my daughter Michelle. Now my claim to her is she has more degrees than Mussolini has medals. Like she's got an honors Bachelor of Commerce degree from Queen's University. When she first got married, she moved to the West Coast. She got a job with Paul Revere. She earned her FLMI. Okay? There are not too many people who have the internal insurance degree. Then she's got a CLU, she's got a CHFC, she's got a TEP, she's got this, she's got degrees coming out of her ears. Well, when she was doing LTD business in the West Coast, she was providing quotes to other agents. I found I could get my quotes from my daughter faster than I could get them here in Toronto from the same company. And when she would ask me about who that was for, and the need was, and she would say, "Well, Dad, have you thought about this?" And I'd say, "No." And she said, "Well, let me put it in the quote." And I would say, "Yes." And, and most of the time she was right too. So eventually they moved back to Toronto, and she changed disability companies. And then she thought, well, why am I not selling the whole schmear? So she came to me and she said, can I come into business? And I said, well, as long as you don't want my clientele, you've got to earn it. Yes. So she came over to me, got licensed, and her first year goals makes uh, probably most people uh, very look like amateurs. She decided that her first goal was to qualify for the MDRT in the first year, unlike her dad. Second goal, she was going to get pregnant. And third, she was going to get her CLU degree, I think was about the pitch. And she managed all three
In 1 year.
in 1 year. Yeah. She worked, she was very well organized. And and then as I grew older and we got into multi-company representation, and I became totally disabled at age 57. Thank God I had her. My disability qualified me to get the CPP disability benefit. And I then went to the Count of Life and I said, uh, I think I qualify to go on the company's disability plan, but I think I'm paying for it all because of my renewals. And our vice president of sales was a gentleman by the name of Norm Daly. And Norm said, leave it with me. And 48 hours later, he told me to get up to his office. And he said, Ross, you're going to keep all your renewals. You're not going to get any disability income, but we're going to put you on pension. And the pension we're going to give you is the same pension that you would have gotten at age 65. And I got that. And um, um, uh, the person who was succeeded Norm was an actuary, and he asked me what guarantee I'd like, and I told him, and he said, well, have you thought about this guarantee, Ross? And I said, yes, but it might cost my widow too much money, or me too much money. And he said, well, let me get a quote for you. It was 50 cents difference to take the superior guarantee. Now, I don't know many companies that go that far to help, but
That was like a
so,
full survivorship benefit was what.
but full, yeah, and really, the I was able, through my respirologist, I was on 100 milligrams of prednisone. I got some side effects, but he weaned me over 2 years off prednisone. But I had to depend on those 2 years for the grunt work to be done by Michelle. So, of course, I decided, the laborer is worthy of his hire, his or her hire. And so I started splitting all the business with her. And so I was very fortunate to hire people like office managers. And my last office manager, I got it as a referral from one of the associates in the branch which I worked out of. He said, this young lady is working in word processing. And I said, oh. And she said, I understand that Pat is leaving. I said, yes, she is. And he said, well, you should interview this young woman. And so I made an excuse to go down to the word processing in the branch. And I said to this Lynn, I said, Lynn, I understand you might be looking for a new challenge. And she said, yes. And she said, but I understand you're very demanding and hard to work for. I said, well, Lynn, why don't you come upstairs and talk to me about it at 5 o'clock? So she said, okay. And so at 5 o'clock, she came up and I said, Lynn, if you decide to take the position, I expect you to make mistakes. With that, her eyes opened wide. She said, what do you mean? Well, I said, I'm still learning. I don't expect you to know all the forms right off the bat. You're going to have to learn. Oh, she said, well, what do I have to do? Well, I said, we use word processing up here. He said, okay. And I said, I dictate letters. I make mistakes in grammar. But I said, when I reread the letter, I make changes to the letter. Those are not your responsibility. those are my responsibility. What I expect from you is that before you hand a letter in to me, you run it through the spelling checker. I do not want to see any spelling mistakes. I never saw a spelling mistake from her. But I would read her letter and I would I would make changes to the letter, and she would finish the letter off. And I told her when she retired, she was going to be a wealthy lady. I did not. She is now retired, and I fulfilled my promise to her. And she is independent financially. But I always remember her as being her niece, Amber, had brain cancer. When Lynn left the office at 5 o'clock at night, she just didn't go home. She went up to Sick Children's Hospital where this young lady was dying, and she would play card games like Snap and Scrabble with her and read to her until the day she died. And Lynn had 2 kids. The kids are still friends of mine. And, I still have a friendship relationship with Lynn. And she worked for Michelle too.
That's excellent, Ross. It shows that the relationships that you have are with clients, with family, with company, the Canada Life, with the profession, with the needy, with the people who can help the needy because of the association that you have with the foundations, whether it's North York or the MDRT. Ross, it seems to me that making a commitment and keeping a commitment has been a major thing for you. Can you speak to that?
Your whole life is a commitment. It's a promise to others. I guess the biggest commitment I ever made was to Marilyn, my wife. When I asked her to marry me. That's my big commitment. I promised to do everything that I could for her and and our children. I hope I've kept that promise. And so and then you have commitments to your companies. Now I used to be one company, and in many ways I like single company representation because the companies in those days reciprocated. Now I'm not so sure that the companies just don't want the business, and they don't want you involved any longer. And their clients, the only way their clients are really going to be served is if the agent stays involved. And I don't know how this can be communicated to companies. But this business, like, you make a commitment to your church and to God, and part of making a commitment to your religion, regardless of what it is to help others. You've got, if you don't want to help others, I don't care what business you're in. People have difficulties and they need help. That's the way I feel about it.
Ross, it is clear that you have stuck by that through your entire career in life, that you have made a difference, and that you've helped people to do what we learned in the very first LUATC, which is to help them to understand that they'll make a fortune between then and the time that they retire or die, and to help them protect that money and
That's
those
right.
commitments to their family. And you're a perfect example of that. Thank you, Ross Durant, for joining us today for Meet the Masters. Next week, unfortunately, we have a gap. Bill Bell, who was to speak, unfortunately will not be able to again. So the following week, which is the 21st of this month, Miles Posner will be speaking. The week following that, we have Mr. Joel Kadeski. The week after that, Paul Williamson, another great in the business. Joe Sheehan follows him. And then to end the year, we have Lauren McNeil on December the 19th. So we look forward to seeing you on November the 21st for the next Meet the Masters of Insurance webinar with Miles Posner. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great week and a great weekend.